Well, it's now been 2 years since Congress passed the Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act, or WPEA. It was meant to turn the tide and allow for more protections to whistleblowers. But now some are questioning whether the law has accomplished what it set out to do. Just last week, the House Subcommittee on Federal Workforce heard testimony from a panel of agency officials, whistleblowers, and transparency advocates on how the administration is treating federal employees who call out government wrongdoing. The testimony showed that some whistleblowers are still suffering major retaliation, reprisals, and retribution, and are often pushed out of the government. To talk about this a little bit more earlier, I was joined by one of the panelists who testified at this hearing, Tom Devine. He's the legal director of the Government Accountability Project. And I first asked him about what he has called a new method of retribution against whistleblowers.
For whistleblowers, it's been the best and the worst of times, with an exclamation point. And really, the buck has to stop with President Obama as well as the credit. And since you asked about the bad news, the administration's lawyers have prosecuted more whistleblowers than all other presidents combined. And we're seeing that tactics creeping down into the bureaucracy, that instead of firing whistleblowers, the idea is to open up a criminal investigation and brand them as crooks. And that's a lot scarier than just losing your job.
And those affected aren't just senior officials. They are anyone who falls into what you've called sensitive jobs, or a sensitive jobs loophole. Talk a little bit more about what you meant by that.
Well, that's the second problem that's really a horrible threat, probably the worst threat to the nonpartisan professional civil service since the Watergate scandal. It's a proposal that the White House lawyers have gotten the Supreme Court not to block, that would create a national security loophole that could cover virtually the entire civil service. And it won't be necessary to fire someone. You can just say, you're no longer eligible for a sensitive job, and you fire them through the back door with all the muss and fuss of due process or a day in court or a trial. And it really could set up a national security spoils system to replace the professional civil service we have.
Now, as I understand it, there were a couple of different whistleblowers at this hearing to share their story. What about their experiences would the public find most alarming, do you think?
I think probably the scariest to me is the threat to a federal air marshal who almost single-handedly stopped our government from going AWOL during a more ambitious rerun of the 9/11 attack during 2003. The government admitted that it made a mistake by planning to remove all the air marshals from the long-distance flights targeted by al-Qaeda during a planned strike that would cover European capitals as well as West Coast cities and Washington, D.C. It was sort of like 9/11 was a skirmish for the climactic global terrorist attack. And we are going to abandon defenses of those planes. This air marshal blew the whistle. He stopped the mistake within 24 hours, but now he's being fired because the information that he used to expose the mistake was classified 3 years after the fact as sensitive. And then he was fired for threatening national security and the safety of our country by exposing a mistake that would have left us defenseless. And the legal issue behind it is that individual agencies can cancel the statutory free speech rights of the Whistleblower Protection Act through their own internal secrecy regulations. And that means the rights for freedom of speech and freedom to warn will be replaced by the right for agencies to cover up.
It's incredible that they were able to retroactively prosecute him. That is incredible. And you've listed several areas of unfinished business for this act that it was, of course, just implemented in 2012. What needs to be done at this point to achieve what people hoped this act would originally achieve?
Well, I think the main thing that we have to have is stamina in enforcement of the rights that were unanimously approved. And there you've got to give the president credit. He personally led the fight for the strongest free speech law in history for government workers. He personally took executive action so that there's freedom of speech within the intelligence community for those workers for the first time in history. And he's appointed the most dedicated, knowledgeable officials that I've seen in 35 years to actually implement these rights and enforce them. That's good. But the government workers, we're not finished. We have to beat back these threats that have popped up in the last few years. And unlike private sector whistleblowers, corporate whistleblowers, government employees don't have the right to seek justice in court and have their rights decided by a jury of the citizens they're purporting to defend. And until that happens, government employees' free speech rights are always very vulnerable to political pressure.
That was Tom Devine, legal director at the Government Accountability Project.